Welcome to the Emotional Balance Sheet Podcast, your guide to help you manage life, money, and multiples. Each episode, host Paul Fenner, Tama Capital's president and founder, and the proud parent of 4 amazing children, including 1 set of triplets, will provide insights on successfully sustaining an active lifestyle, career, and family through comprehensive wealth management strategies, financial education, and lifestyle planning, specific to parents raising twins, triplets, and more. Learn more, subscribe to the show, or connect with Paul at tamacapital.com.
This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be relied upon for investment decisions. Clients of Tama may retain positions in the securities discussed in this podcast.
How are you adjusting to parenting as we move into a post-COVID world? Are you back to the rat race and overscheduling that so many parents experienced before COVID? Dr. Lindsay Malloy is an associate professor of psychology at Ontario Tech University, specializing in developmental and forensic psychology. Lindsay is also the co-founder of Pandemic Parenting, a nonprofit organization providing free and accessible science-based resources to parents and caregivers. Pandemic Parenting began as a collaboration between Dr. Amanda Zelahowski, a previous guest, and Lindsay, 2 psychologists, scholars, and moms committed to sharing their experience and research with families. Lindsay discusses strategies parents can use to help their kids adapt to an ever-changing environment, from establishing routines and maintaining adequate self-care to understanding that your vision of balance today may look completely different than the day before. As Lindsay points out, comparison is the thief of joy. Lindsay and her team have turned Pandemic Parenting into a digital hub for parents with multiple mediums and resources, no matter what stage of parenting you may be at. It is a free resource that I encourage all parents to take advantage of as we continue navigating through this pandemic. Please enjoy my conversation with Dr. Lindsay Malloy. So, Dr. Lindsay Malloy, welcome to the Emotional Balance Sheet Podcast.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Yes, I know it's been a journey getting to this part, and you're recording in 100-degree heat with no AC in London, England. So,
indeed,
you are you get the gold star for podcast appearances thus far.
Thank you. Yeah, I might just melt into a puddle at some point. So, just carry on.
Well, the funny thing is that when we were talking before we hit record, you're like showing me the ice pack that you have on your neck because it's
I know
so hot.
I honestly have an ice pack. So it's just like old fashioned cooling down.
Yeah. Going old school. So we had your partner, Dr. Amanda Zelahowski on last year. And between the two of you, you run this fantastic podcast called Pandemic Parenting. Like we were talking about, I don't know exactly how I got a hold of that, but I did and reached out to Amanda and we had this Notre Dame connection. And then we find out her sister lives in Metro Detroit where I live. And she also has a set of triplets. So it's, 0 degrees of separation when it comes to the two of you, it seems like. So
definitely.
But I'm been excited about having this conversation, having this continued dialogue when it comes to COVID and parenting and families. So I think the best place to start is to have you walk our audience through your background, like what you actually do, because you have a amazing title, this associate professor of forensic psychology. So I'm interested more on what exactly that means, but then how you and Amanda started Pandemic Parenting Podcast.
Sure. So, I'm actually originally from Michigan, so I did my undergraduate work there. And then my training is actually in developmental psychology. And so that's what my PhD is in, but my research and what I've been working on for really the last 20 years has all been research that relates to children's involvement in the legal system. So sort of an interaction between developmental psychology and the law. And so that's why, I work in a forensic psychology department at Ontario Tech University. So I am an associate professor of forensic psychology. But again, I have all this child development background and training, and that's what my research is in. So I look a lot at like children's memory and how they disclose and talk about negative experiences that they've had. A lot of times when those experiences have implications for legal context, like they have to be interviewed about maltreatment that they might have experienced and that sort of thing. So with Amanda and I, the bizarre thing is we haven't even actually met in person still to this day. And we've had this nonprofit for
That is amazing. I didn't know that.
I know. It's like the most pandemic thing ever. That we have this whole nonprofit organization together and do this podcast, and we've never met in person. But we both have some similar research interests. We're familiar with each other's work as we were talking about it on Twitter, that we were both launching these studies on looking at, mental health impacts of COVID on kids when it was first starting in March of 2020. And so Amanda had reached out to me that summer of 2020 to say, I have some ideas about how we might be able to get research that's going to be coming out in the next few months into the hands of parents, as it's happening, kind of, because there's this big lag with like how long it takes scientific research to reach people, if it ever does. And so Amanda had this wonderful idea of, just doing a few webinars to, give parents some key information as we were all struggling with lockdowns and, homeschooling and all of that. And, then it turned into this several years thing that we really couldn't have anticipated, but that we're, excited about.
So you guys met on Twitter.
Yeah, well, we attend the same conference every year for the most part, but we hadn't actually met there. So we sort of knew of each other, like we kind of in the same academic circles, sort of, so to speak. But yeah, we met, we really got to know each other via Twitter.
Okay. And it's interesting because you guys really have this unique specialty when it comes to, like you were describing, child development with the law and legal system, because Amanda has her JD. I mean, she's an attorney as well, not to mention the psychologist as well. So that is fascinating how you guys connected like this. But
absolutely,
the podcast has been amazing, and just the site itself has just been a treasure trove of great information for parents. And I link to it all the time and suggest people check it out as much as possible, because you're right. Sometimes that data never ends up in our hands as parents because just don't know where to find it. And with all the misinformation that's out there, it can kind of get lost in the shuffle.
Exactly. We wanted to provide some good research-based information, and not only just on research that was going to be coming out about the pandemic itself, but just in general, we realized that we had access to a lot of people who knew about stuff, right, that was going to matter, like child anxiety and other sorts of things. And then we also had just basic child development and, teen development knowledge that we realized could be helpful. And I mean, sometimes we're struggling with our own questions and our own difficulties with our own kids, like, okay, sibling conflict during the pandemic when we're all trapped in this house, like, who can we get on to talk about that and who has expertise in that? So sometimes it was just this, like, we need these answers ourselves as well as parents. And so it was a good experience for us too.
Yeah. I mean, there's so my triplets will be 12 this December, and there's two areas or two segments of life, I guess, that I would really like to forget. One is that first year when they were born. It sounds awful, but the sleep deprivation was no joke, because I drew the short stick and did the midnight round shift of feeding. And the second was that March to end of December 2020 with COVID, going from homeschool to pods to back to school to back to some kind of online. It was just a disaster.
Absolutely. Yeah.
One of the things that keeps coming up in multiple conversations that I've been having with parents is that we keep going from like one extreme to the other. So lockdowns, March of 2020, one extreme.
Mm-hmm.
Then we
Mm-hmm.
start coming out. We shut down. We shut down. And now that we are, I guess, COVID's still here. It's going to be here for a long time, if not forever.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
We're coming out of it, and people are going back to that hectic, crazy, overscheduled, busy lives that we had
Mm-hmm.
before COVID. And
Mm-hmm.
that's one of the questions that I keep coming up with. I'm like, how do we get back to this stage where parents are back to like running themselves ragged?
Yeah. Yeah, no, I know. And I feel that myself because I think it might depend a bit on how old your kids were when the pandemic hit, because and whether you were able to realize, well, these were the things that were working before the pandemic or weren't working, and these are the things we want to continue, or these are the things that we want to do differently. And I think that if you look at the research, a lot of parents are reporting that COVID, as terrible as it's been, has allowed them to sort of reevaluate some priorities and think about, well, these were the things we really missed and would like to get back to. And these are the things that we didn't love. And, maybe we'll just let them go. But it might depend on how old your kids are, I think, because for me, my kids were so young when it hit that I don't even really know what they like. We never even really reached that overscheduled running around to different activities phase because they were too young to do a lot of the activities. And so I have to be careful right now that things are returning more to normal, that my husband's kind of like, okay, just hold on a minute, because I want to sign them up for literally everything, because I'm like, we didn't get to do this, and let's do hockey, and let's, get them into gymnastics and dancing. And it's like, okay, well, let's make sure that it's still going to be fun and that they're actually going to enjoy it. Am I doing it for me, or am I doing it for them? And I think that's an important question to ask. So it's one thing if your child is coming to you and is really eager to get back to the sports or the dance or whatever it was. But I would say stop and think about if it's for you or for them, and who's it for, and was it working before? How could you make it work differently now after the pandemic?
Yeah, I would completely agree with you. And I think that Teresa and I are in the same boat that you and your husband are in, because I'm the one kind of like trying to step on the gas, and Teresa's like, put the pedal to the metal, if you will.
Yeah.
It's really tough because it's like, in a lot of ways, it reminds me of the stock market that we've experienced these last couple of years too. It's like we've rode this roller coaster all the way up, and now we're riding it all the way down. And it's such an emotional journey. And I think we don't do a good enough job of stepping back and asking ourselves the question you just did: is this for my kids, or is this for me? And I think that's that inner struggle that a lot of people are having. And it's easy just to get sucked back into it all without taking a measured pace of, okay, is this the right thing to be doing?
And is it actually fun? Or, is it serving? Maybe some things you do are not fun. Like maybe swimming lessons are not fun, but you feel like, okay, that there's a safety element there. And so we need to do that. Right. So not everything has to be fun, but I think, thinking, is this actually fun? Is it serving the purpose that we would like it to serve? Or is it just something that we're doing to tick a box because we think that we should be doing this? That this is what a good parent does based on what, I don't know, things we're reading or things we think we should be doing based on what our neighbors are doing or our friends are doing. So for me, I really have to step back and look at those questions. And I think the pandemic forced me and a lot of other parents, if you look at the research, to do those kinds of things, which I suppose is a silver lining in some ways.
Yeah, I think that aligned well to this great resignation that's happening with people's careers. People taking a deeper dive into, what is it that I really want to do with my career? What do I really want to do with my life? What do I really want to do as a parent? And I think that's, personally, this was an inner struggle that I was dealing with before COVID, and my reading and research on trying to help define what is enough for me. And also what I was seeing a lot with the family office clients that I work with, and them struggling with those same things. And then obviously COVID happens. And then for some people it was a boom, and some people, for others, it was a bust. So it's this tug of war, I think, that has again gotten escalated because of the pandemic.
Yeah. And I think it reminds me of, I was thinking about this today, actually, these research studies that were done, quite a long time ago, big longitudinal studies looking at the effects of childcare and maternal employment on kids. And, longitudinal study in the US that was done across multiple sites. It was a really important study. But one of the things that they found, and that they found in other studies too, is that, there are links between maternal employment and depression. When you look at, okay, let me back up and just say, basically, it depends on is it what you want, or is it something that you're being forced into? So I think if the pandemic led people to reevaluate, maybe cut back on their hours at work, or, not go for a promotion because they've realized what's important to them and they want to focus more on family or whatever it is, then that could actually have some good effects for their mental health and some benefits there. But if they're, reduced working hours and they're not getting a promotion and stuff, but that is actually not what they want, then it can have these problematic effects on mental health. And you saw that with those childcare studies too. Basically, if moms wanted to be working but couldn't for whatever reason, that wasn't great for them. If they didn't want to be working, they wanted to be a stay-at-home mom, but they were forced into the workforce, that also didn't have great effects for them. And then, that depression, that maternal depression, can obviously have impacts on kids. There's quite a bit of research on that. So I think it's like, what is happening with people's careers, and is it something that they're actually wanted to happen based on how the pandemic affected them and their family, or is it something that they were kind of backed into a corner with? And I think has really important implications for how it plays out for them, whether it's like a welcome change or a really tough change.
And I think that's a really interesting point, because that kind of like dovetails into the other current theme of the situation when it comes to careers right now and families are people that were working from home now either going back to the office because they want to, or being forced to go back in the office because companies are mandating that. And that's a struggle I see with many of my families that I work with, because during some stints, people were working more from home, but they lost their commute time, which helped. Now, again, kind of going back to kids' crazy, activity schedules and having to go back into the office. How do you juggle that? And that's one thing that Teresa and I are struggling with now. And I mean, it's just, again, it's going back to, okay, is this what we really want to be doing? So go ahead.
Oh, no, I was just thinking my husband used to have basically 2.5 hours of commuting, and it's looking at that now, it's like, how did we ever do that? How did we make that work? Because it seems impossible now. And I know that we did, but there were things that, really didn't work about it in ways that it's beneficial. And if you look at the research, a lot of people report they're much happier when they can work from home, maybe a few days a week, that they're much more productive. But then other people report not being productive. And I think it's just this, and not liking it and wanting the social interaction of the office. So again, I think it's comes down to these individual difference pieces, and that there's no one clear answer for what's going to work for people post-pandemic, because there wasn't really one clear answer, for what worked for people before the pandemic. So it's just kind of magnified now.
And I think that's the interesting thing about what you and Amanda and your field does, whether call it behavioral science, behavioral psychology, forensic psychology, you're digging into all this data, but it still comes back to individual preferences and where you are in life. Because if you're say a younger parent that's still earlier in their career, getting in and into an office environment and being more face to face with people as you're trying to move up the corporate ladder, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
There's definitely probably pros to being in the office versus maybe somebody in our situation where we're, more secure in our career. We're not necessarily looking to make that big jump up.
Mm-hmm.
You're looking to save time, not necessarily like build more
Yes.
relationships and move up.
Yeah, definitely.
The other thing that the topic I wanted to really dive into, kind of along the lines you were just talking about this before, about the social and academic impacts that this has had on kids. That's the other main question or concern that I have personally, and that I also get from families as well. As how I know that this has affected my kids in some way, shape, or form, but it's still hard to put a pulse on what that impact really was and how it may continue to change and develop. Have you been able to peel back any, findings from your research and data that you, or maybe even Amanda, have dove into when it comes to kids being now potentially socially behind and academically behind?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think the picture that's emerging is, again, this same theme of like very uneven effects, right? That it was very different for different groups of people. And so, you have some kids who were, potentially not doing well at all, right? As a result of schools closing or of the pandemic. You have some that are doing okay. You have some that may have even improved in some ways. So first, I guess, let me back up and say, kids were getting socialization and learning some social skills even during the pandemic. So even young kids who were just interacting with maybe their family members, there's still some socialization, some social learning that's happening there. They're interacting with parents, with maybe with siblings, with, people online. So they can still glean quite a lot from those experiences. So I think that's a good thing. Also, I would say, keep in mind that children change so rapidly, especially the young ones. And so what you're seeing after this amount of time, I mean, it has been several years now. So what you're seeing may not be attributable to the pandemic, right? I think it's a very natural thing for us to say, well, for example, like stranger anxiety in infants, we know that peaks around 15 months. And so people might look at a baby who's kind of getting more socialization and see them being scared and think, oh, well, look what the pandemic did, right? Like they have all this anxiety around strangers. Well, that's not, that may not have nothing to do with the pandemic. That's just typical development, right? So I think it's important to just keep in mind, again, that kids change so rapidly and dramatically. And we need to be careful about not thinking that something is the effect of the pandemic when it might actually just be, well, our child is, has a kind of slow to warm up temperament and they like to, take some time in new social situations. And that might be, entirely normal for them. So in terms of, strategies for our kids recovering in these areas, I think that's important to think about. And there's things that we can do as parents, continuing to establish and follow routines, being involved, all those things that we know that mattered, before the pandemic. But on a much broader level, I've seen a lot coming out lately about the importance of taking a holistic approach, that we have to focus on children's well-being and mental health first, or at least kind of simultaneously with improving their academic skills, or they just won't be able to learn. So they're not going to be able to catch up academically if we don't kind of consider the whole child. That includes things like, well, we obviously want them to catch up on things like reading and math, which are maybe really crucial for them down the road. But some schools have taken the approach of like, well, let's just focus on those core subjects and let's not have like art or music or physical education, sports, these other things that I think, are really important for outlets for kids and kind of can help them maybe recover socially and academically as well. So to really consider that and not just be so focused on, we need them to improve in these, in these key areas. And so that's all we're thinking about as parents or teachers.
Can you, and maybe you just answered this, but can you expand on what you mean by taking a more holistic approach?
Sure. Well, just making sure that we're focusing on and maybe even treating first any sort of mental health issues, trauma, really focusing on their well-being first and foremost. And so for a lot of kids, coming back to school, they might have kids may have lost really important people in their lives. Many children in the US lost a parent or caregiver. So we really have to be mindful of these things and focus, when I say holistically, I mean, that's the term that's been used in the literature, but just thinking about like the whole child and the fact that we're not going to be able to really make big strides academically if we are really struggling in terms of mental health and emotionally.
So when it comes to, are there signs that parents should be aware of, when they see maybe their kids struggling with, really social interactions because they've missed out on these last couple of years? And I know you pointed out that, our kids were still getting social interaction, with us at home, interacting online,
Mm-hmm.
but are there warning signs that you've seen in the data that we should be looking for as parents?
Yeah, I think we have a podcast episode with doctors Donna Pincus and Jill Aaron Reich May. That's really great. That talks about child anxiety, and they do a great job of talking about that, like social interaction and social anxiety, and what are some key things to look for. So I definitely recommend that to any parents who want to dive into that more deeply. But I would say, are there things where it's affecting their life, right? Like they are refusing to go, maybe even refusing to go to school or refusing to engage with others. Like, they are declining going to birthday parties and to other things. They used to play sports and now, they don't want to play any sports. So I would say big changes in behavior, which of course that's kind of hard to do because of course there are big changes when there was a pandemic, but is it impairing their lives? And especially if they want to do those things, like they want to have friends, they would like to go to the birthday party, they would like to engage, but they feel like they don't know how, or that they feel really anxious or nervous about it to the point where they don't do it. That would, I would say, be a big warning sign.
Because we have this very interesting petri dish, sometimes I refer to my family situation, where we have these 4 kids, including, obviously a set of triplets, and obviously they're all different. That's one thing I still get asked when I tell people I have triplets. Well, are they all the same? I'm like, no, they're all individual people. Even the triplets, there's a girl and identical twin boys. I mean, even the boys are completely different. And that's what's interesting, because I've seen one kind of become more outgoing and the other one become more introverted, where he doesn't like to be involved in sports or really activities. I mean, he would prefer to game online, but when he's online gaming, he's usually doing it with other people, other friends of his. So that's part that I'm trying to get my arms wrapped around. And like, is this good? Is this bad? Is it just the way that, kids are growing up these days? Because I mean, if I had access to electronic device the way that he did, more than likely I might be the same way. I don't know.
Yeah, no. And I have 2 very different kids as well. And I think I struggle with, I'm more outgoing and extroverted, and I have a kid who is quite shy. And so it's been a learning experience for me to figure out ways that I can push him a little bit, right? Like I want to give him little pushes, but ones that don't lead to a lot of stress for him. So maybe we try something new, or, we go to the party and I'm there next to him for the first 10 minutes. And then I kind of, drop back a little bit more. So give him a little bit more time to get used to the situation. Whereas my other kid's like, bye, see you later. Yeah. And so I need to be careful about not kind of putting my own like behavioral tendencies and thinking that, why doesn't he just do this? Why doesn't he just want to do that?
Yeah, I think that's a really challenging aspect of parenting for all of us parents, not to go down that road. I know I struggle with it for a long time, like with my one son that I was just mentioning, because I'm very competitive, love sports. He doesn't. And it's taken me this last year to really like, okay, let me back off. Like, this is his life. I'm trying to give him more responsibility, more choices, kind of expand his boundaries. And, if this is what he really likes to do, then let me try to figure out a way to help him do that, whether it's like esports or something like that. I think I brought this up before, this whole this holy grail of defining like what enough is. And I think as parents, especially, a lot of people are striving for this other holy grail or imaginary place called balance. And I don't think it exists. But I would love to get your take, and let me put it in context, where the way that I explain this when it comes up in conversations with families is, there are certain points where your family is going to have to take precedence. There's certain points where your career is going to have to take precedence, certain points where yourself is going to have to take precedence. So it's understanding and really being able to prioritize what's important. And I think it comes back to awareness and really being aware of when you have to constantly make these pivots to what needs your attention the most. So this idea of things being always in perfect balance, I think from my perspective, and reading and research that I do on this, is just, it's kind of like a fallacy, but I would love your take as a forensic psychologist.
Yeah. Well, it just made me think of this meme that I saw recently that was like, I can have a clean house, clean kids, or clean self, but like not all three, because it's just not possible. And I think I might be one of the world's worst people to ask about balance, in that, I always say too, that I'm searching for it. I do a pretty terrible job at it. I've come to kind of accept that my idea of balance might look different from someone else's, and that's okay. And I try to remember that phrase, like, comparison is the thief of joy. But, it's like, I say that I want more work-life balance, but then I make decisions that are incompatible with that. So, I think there are individual differences here too, when it comes to balance, and after the pandemic, I do say no to more things. And I've heard this from other people, and this has come up in the research too, right? That it's been a little bit empowering of an experience, that people might have really understood more about what they really want and been willing to say no to other things. And I think when I think about balance now after the pandemic, I think a lot about balancing our own needs with our kids' needs, because at the beginning of the pandemic, I was just so 100% focused on my kids' needs and how this was going to affect them. And I remember doing this webinar with, it was on Good Enough Parenting. And our guest just said to me, well, you matter too. And it's such a simple thing. I was like, oh, yeah, that's right. I guess I do. And, then there was a lot that was coming out about, you need to make sure that you put your own oxygen mask on first before you can actually help your kids. I was just going to say that. Yep. And it's so like, it's just so true. And I think I learned a lot about balancing my own needs with my kids' needs, and that I really couldn't be there for them as a good mom, whatever good mom means, but like as the most effective parent I could be if I wasn't taking a little time for myself, or trying to figure out ways that I could, engage in, so I guess you could call it self-care, even though sometimes that term, drives me nuts, but just
I was literally
myself.
Lindsay going to say that same thing. Like self-care, that term I think gets a bad rap because it's like you say self-care, I think people have this negative connotation that, okay, it's just selfish. Well, I think it goes back to the airline, put your mask on first before you can put it on somebody else. Well, if you're not taking, and I think it goes back to what I said earlier, it's like you have all these competing, and this is like one of my opening lines when I first meet with people on the family office side of what I do, is that you have all these competing financial and personal priorities tugging at you.
Mm-hmm.
And what I try to get people to think about is to take some time and bring that awareness full center to help figure out what's really important, what's purposeful in your life, your family's life, and go from that angle. It's funny because most people, when they show up in my office, think we're going to talk about numbers. And it's my secret is like, no, we're going to talk about everything else but numbers today, because that's, to me, that's the foundational piece of financial planning that most people miss or don't understand, or have this negative stereotype that, it really starts with your family values or purpose. Without that, you can't build your goals and objectives. You can't, build the action items you need to do to be able to achieve and support that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think most people don't really take the time to sit back and think about those things. And I'm not saying we did have the time to do that during the pandemic, but in some ways we might've been forced into it. It was like life created this challenge, opportunity, I don't know what you want to call it, to take stock of those things. And it's not one that we ever would have chosen intentionally, but in some ways we were kind of forced to think about those things.
I know I only have you for a finite period of time, especially today, because you probably are needing a new ice pack. But one of my last questions I wanted to ask is, and I mentioned this, at the beginning of our conversation, of what a wealth of knowledge and resource your guys' website, Pandemic Parenting, is. And obviously we're going to put that in the show notes, but what would you say would be some of the most impactful resources that people could go to the site and really utilize to help put into practice today?
Yeah, definitely. Well, I already mentioned the episode on child anxiety, which I think was really great, straightforward advice for parents. We did a podcast episode about how to reduce children's anxiety and pain from shots, right? From getting vaccines.
Yes, I actually remember that one.
Yeah, that one is actually our most downloaded episode. And I think it's excellent because it's really clear, practical advice that, deals with an issue that many parents are facing right now, or, will be facing maybe again. So it's really a good one, I think. And Amanda has recently been doing season 2 entirely on her own, and I'm very grateful to her for that. And she's done a phenomenal job looking at what we've actually learned about children and parents and families from the pandemic, right? Looking at all the research that's come out during COVID. And there have been hundreds of studies done, really too many for any parent or even any researcher to kind of keep up with and figure out what they all mean. And she's done an amazing job of having people on to talk about, well, what are the key messages for parents and what have we learned? Like, how has this affected our kids? And I think that's really great because that's coming up in this episode. Like, well, what do we know? Like what has the impact been? And so there's some great episodes on that. And a more general episode just on helping parents understand research. Like, we see these headlines in the news that there's been a new study, and this episode really delves into like, how do we teach parents how to critically analyze research? Because sometimes something comes out, and I'm in all these online parenting groups, and it causes a lot of stress and sometimes unnecessarily so. And then the last thing I'll say is one thing I love about our website is our digital content producer, Victoria Bruick, has done an amazing job where you can go in and you can say, what age group you're looking for information on, or you can look for resources by topic, or you can look for resources based on who you are. Like, I'm a single parent or I'm a working parent. And so you can look in lots of different ways to find out what you might need.
So that brings me to my closing question. Okay. And that is, and we know that you're a mom of two that you had mentioned. Mm-hmm. So what is your favorite thing about being a parent?
My kids, I think. No, let me think. So, I mean, there's so many things. I love watching them learn new things. One of the silver linings of the pandemic for me was getting to watch my older one learn how to read and kind of be more actively involved in that than I would have been. And I love reading myself. And so it was just such a joy to like watch him discover this whole world. And it was also really hard and frustrating at times, but getting to watch him, do that or have new experiences. Like, we moved to England this year for my sabbatical, and it was a huge challenge. And especially for, my child who's a bit more shy, but to be able to watch them like overcome these challenges and try new things and have these new experiences, I think has been really amazing. So that's probably my favorite part.
Well, I think I've been doing the show now for almost 2 years, and that's been my closing question for most every episode. And the breadth and the depth of people's answers is just amazing. And it's I can't thank you enough, Lindsay, for being on the show. And we'll definitely have a lot of links to the great resources on the Pandemic Parenting website and podcast that you and Amanda host. So I can't thank you enough for your time, and hopefully you can go cool off a little bit now.
Yes. Thank you for having me. Appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Emotional Balance Sheet Podcast. Please visit tamacapital.com to subscribe to this podcast or to connect with certified financial planner and registered investment advisor Paul Fenner of Tama Capital. And please join us again next time on the Emotional Balance Sheet Podcast.